good morning. I know it is good morning for to some of you. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, coming from different time zones. And it's so lovely to connect with you all, and also in kind of a format where all of us are together, but at different time zones. Lovely technology. I enjoy technology when we can use technology in this manner. So it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this symposium, which is our sixth edition of the RAI Opinion. And RAI, as you all know, is Riskat Initiative based in Abu Dhabi. As part of this initiative, we have started exhibitions, we have talks and presentations, which we call it the RAI Opinion. And also we have residencies, fellowships, and we have almost completed 1 year of our existence. We started in November 2023, and it was funded and started by Shafina Yusuf Ali, who has also joined us in this thing, but she's on a traveling mode. She might or might not join to contribute, but she might, knowing her, she might. I know I'm putting her on the spot now. And so that is the journey that we have become, and also the happiness of sharing this in this format is to also announce to the world that we are part of the UAE Cultural Network in a big way, and we have kind of reached quite a lot of places, and people are coming to us. So that's also a kind of we are very happy to be in that space in one time, and so it's kind of a big pleasure for me to invite Premjish to this, who has curated this symposium and also curated our exhibition, which is going on now, Imperial Silhouettes, and the Shadows of Sovereignty, and also this symposium, which is called Reclaiming Narratives, Perspectives on Sovereignty. And the good thing was that Premjish brought in almost 18 artists from 14 different countries with very leading voices in this theme, as well as the discussions and the inspirations that we got out of the exhibition was amazing. It was immense. And putting together this symposium was very important for us. We tried different formats, and suddenly then we thought, why not the online format, which made it possible so that we could hear all the voices, most of the voices which we could get in this short period of time. And to introduce Premjish, he is a curator, writer based in Delhi. I've known him for some time. He's done some amazing shows in India, which I've been part of. I've been following his work. And he has now joined the Nadar Museum as part of the curatorial team. And so I'm so happy. Please join me in welcoming Premjish and Symposium, as well as I'll ask Malvika now to introduce us to the participants, as well as take us through the symposium. Thank you so much, Malvika. Please, over to Malvika.
Thank you, Meena. So nice to see everyone online, even if it's online, so nice to see everyone's faces. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our three speakers along with Premjish. We have Bibi Hajra joining us from Pakistan. She's an architect, educator, and visual artist. Bibi dives into themes of urban segregation, development, and religious symbolism in her work. We have Wamboika Miru Colomore, who's from Kenya, who's joining us. And she speaks about decolonization, identity, and African independence through her work. We have Sian Derek from Philippines. He's joining us, I think, from Philippines right now, or from Berlin, Philippines itself. His work looks critically at power structures, and he uses craft and contemporary practices to expose lingering effects of colonialism through his work. It's a pleasure to have the three of you here, and I hope this will prove to be a very engaging symposium for all of us, and we'll learn something through this conversation. Thank you, and Premjish, over to you to introduce the symposium.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and I welcome all of you to this panel discussion titled Reclaiming Narratives, Perspectives on Sovereignty, which we have conceptualized as part of the exhibition that is going on at Risk Art Initiative in Abu Dhabi. The exhibition is called Imperial Silhouettes, Shadows of Sovereignty. I'll talk to you about the exhibition briefly, but if you are in Abu Dhabi, the exhibition is there for a few more days. Please try to visit and see what we have done with the exhibition. And before I start my introduction, I thought I'll share this image that is now circulating, that has become kind of popular in internet and everywhere, to kind of summarize the current situation. Can see the image?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yeah. This picture actually reminded me of the story. If you know, and I think most of you know about the story of the naked king, and it's the child that tells the king that the king is naked. And this reminded me. I don't know if you have seen the video where the junior X tells President Trump that you are not the president, and he asks him to keep quiet. He shushed him and all that stuff. And basically, we can see here how an oligarch has come into power via democracy through electoral mandate, but now openly becoming a puppet, exposing the nexus between technocrats, business people, and democratically elected representatives. So each passing day unfolds this anonymous maxim like never before for me, that is circulated very popularly among the left circles, reeling under the murky shadows of that fading sun of our bad new days. And I quote, it's easy to imagine the end of our planet than that of capitalism. The long twilight of the chaotic eruption that consumed the world as economic breakdown, rapid climate change, emergence of newer geopolitical conflicts, and people's movements crystallized into nefarious forms of hopelessness, lurking from everywhere. And the future bids farewell without promising to rise and shine in the dawn. The sole forecast that is relayed through the trumpets of doomsday prophets is that the light at the end of the tunnel is yet another approaching train. The future is surrendered instead of envisioning utopias. Our vast majority of population has been dreaming dystopias for a long time. The custody of future has been assigned to the whims and fancies of callous technocrats who wield the might of big tech. Imagination of future that is not stuck upon a normative tomorrow is beyond our reach. The future is not a finished project, and it should never be. And each realization of utopia hides a dominant chimera of dystopic potential. But for me, the important question is, how did we arrive here? And this is where I want to begin with two questions. What is sovereignty now? Which is also tied with what is democracy now? And both are important questions to me because uh, democracy, as we all understand, is seen as a system that gives representation to all the citizens, participants of the nation states. But for a long time, it has not been. It has also been used as a system to legitimize such nexus. And one of the important recent contemporary thinkers who has written extensively about it, there are many other people too, but whose work I really admire is Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek minister and the prominent economist, who has expressed his nuanced views on sovereignty, particularly in the context of European politics, because it's very important for all of us, I believe, to go back to Europe always and engage with European politics, economics, and history all the time, because that's what in Hindi we call as all the fasad ki jad, the root of all evils. So it's very important to look at that. But to engage with the topic of democracy and sovereignty, Varoufakis proposes that sovereignty now is very closely tied to democratic governance. Even if we look at European Union for that matter, it has been designed as a democracy-free zone where decision-making power is concentrated in the hands of unelected technocrats and bureaucrats. And this undermines the sovereignty of individual member states and their citizens. In an interview with Yanis Varoufakis, he was asked, "What do you see as the main threats to democracy today?" And his answer was, "A threat to democracy has always been the disdain the establishment has for it." And this is broadly there throughout all political spectrum, whether it is the right, whether it's the left, the liberal democratic spectrum, all of them have this disdain for democracy, and over the time it has been increasing a lot. So democracy by its nature is very fragile, and the antipathy towards it by the establishment is always extremely pronounced, and the establishment has always sought to undo it. And this story goes back, according to Varoufakis, it goes back to ancient Athens, when the challenge to establish democracy was immense. The idea that the free poor, who were the majority, could be put in control of government was always contested. Plato wrote in the Republic as a treatise against democracy, arguing for a government by the experts. And this still continues now. Every claim for social justice is always countered by arguing, or claim for affirmative action is always countered by arguing that we are producing mediocre citizens, we are producing mediocre people. Whereas what we need is a group of experts to make the decision for all of us. And similarly, in the case of Athenian democracy, if you look at the Federalist Papers, and in the case of American democracy, and even if you look at the Federalist Papers and Alexander Hamilton, you will see it was an attempt to contain democracy, not to bolster it. And the same case in India too, right now. The idea behind a representative democracy was to have the merchants represent the rest, because the plebs were not considered up to the task of deciding important matters of state. And the examples, according to Varoufakis, are countless. And just look at what happened to the Mossadegh government in Iran in the 1950s, or the Allende government in Chile, and various other governments in different African countries, Southeast Asian countries, and all. So, whenever the ballot box produces a result the establishment doesn't like, the democratic process is either is overturned or threatened with being overturned. So, if you're asking who are and who have always been the enemies of democracy, the answer is the economically powerful. And I also come from a country where increasingly the representatives in both the upper houses of Indian Parliament, or whether it's the Lok Sabha or Rajya Sabha, seeing this increase in elected representatives who come from an economically upper background with entrepreneurship as their background. And I also come from a state that is also producing a counter politics to it, where again both the spectrums, whether it's the moderate spectrum, the nationalist moderate spectrum of Congress, I and A, both factions, or whether it is the Communist Party of India, Marxist, and CPI, the Communist Party of India, the two factions, have always also given importance to representatives who work from the grassroots, who have been elected from the local levels and risen up to the ranks. And why I'm talking about this is also because of a shared political cultural consciousness which I have with Meena, who gave the introduction, who is also heading the Risk Art Initiative, Shafina, the founder of Risk Art Initiative, and me, Malavika, who is working there. So all of us share this political, cultural consciousness, which is also manifested in the cultural activities, the organization of cultural activities in the state. And I think Kerala is the only state where the government heavily invests in cultural activities and spends exorbitant amounts on retaining and also expanding cultural activities and supporting cultural workers. But there is in other parts of India and also at the central level, this is not the case. And I also mentioned this the cultural scenario and the political scenario because usually when we invite experts from other disciplines like political science, sociology, and all, the interesting reply they give is that, what should I talk about art? I don't want to join a discussion on art. What should I? I don't know anything about art. We have not inviting you to talk about art. We know that you don't know about art, but we also want to hear you out on these very important topics. So please, whenever you get such invites, please join, and your opinions from your field are very important for us. Mina had also talked about the varied timelines, the times, not timelines, the time zones we inhabit. And it also reminded me of the Mexico in 1920s. There's a very interesting book that has come out. It's called A City Against Empire, Transnational Anti-Imperialism 1920 to 1930, written by Thomas K. Lindner. And he starts with the example of the communist activist Julio Antonio Mella, who was exiled from Cuba, and then he selects Mexico because Mexico was the hub of anti-imperial activities of 1920s, not only inhabited by Mexicans but people from different countries, including Indians who were there at that time. Indians in the sense, the undivided India is what I'm talking about. People who were staying there and advocating a politics of anti-imperialism. And Mexico, at that time, was known as a space where left wing radicals of all sorts and ideological shades could count on support of the Mexican government and the city civil society in Mexico City. So the activists use the charm, the talent, the collaboration of these various individuals to form political circus, to discuss, formulate alliances in order to imagine a transnational anti-imperial or a cosmopolitan anti-imperialism, which again is a need of the time. And I think that is what the exhibition was also trying to do, to forge an alliance between the global south. And when I talk about alliance and solidarity, I'm also not talking about an unconditional alliance, homogenizing our experiences, saying that the Indian colonialism is the same as Kenyan colonialism. It's not the same, but there are certain generalizations that could be uh, what you call connected upon. But there are also specificities we need to root our foundations on. So the political activists, the communists, as well as the nationalists, and many others who were in Mexico at that time, shared the notion that the growing influence of US was a threat to the sovereignty of Latin American nations and needed to be fought. And in the 1920s, anti-imperialism was a political watchword, a label under which many political activists, intellectuals, and artists established transnational connections, thereby creating a new geography of resistance in Mexico City. And when we have to reclaim narratives, it is these narratives we need to reclaim. Reclaim narratives of these kind of transnational solidarities, of these places of resistance against empire. And what did anti imperialism mean in Mexico City in the 1920s? And who can be defined as an anti imperialist? For me, anti imperialists were those who expressed their opposition to imperialism and elevated this concern into a central part of their political identity. And the works in this exhibition, the artists in the exhibition also does that very strongly. And the three artists who are part of the panel today are very strong advocates of this, and their works, their practices are also rooted in this effort to unravel the roots of colonial history, the violence of colonial history, memorialization, and also reclaiming sovereignty in various ways. The exhibition offers for me a fertile ground to explore the evolving connections on the concepts of sovereignty in the 21st century. And this proposition delves into the multifaceted dimensions of sovereignty, examining the intersections with power, identity, and resistance. And by analyzing the artworks, by engaging with artworks today, uh, the core concerns of these artists, we are also aiming to unravel the complexities of sovereignty in a globalized world. The traditional notions of statehood or nation states and authority are increasingly challenged by transnational forces, cultural hybridity, and grassroots movements. And the remnants of past empires, the scars of colonialism, and the omnipresence of the empire, as described by Negri and Hart, are all captured within imperial silhouettes. So, some of the areas all of us can think together, or some of the core concerns we all can think together today, is are the decentralization of power and what the shift that is happening in the democratic order and geopolitical conflicts that are arising. How do they challenge the conventional understanding of sovereignty as a monolithic and indivisible entity, especially also in the rise of techno-feudalism, the another important term that coined by Yanis Varoufakis, which is about the rise of the big tech and how it shapes consumption, how it also shapes or dismantles ownership and makes us all dependable into this rented systems of living, constantly kind of projecting our lives onto social medias and being monitored and evaluated and assessed by that. So, what happens to sovereignty in this regard? And also about diaspora and transnationalism, the experiences of diasporic communities, and this also very much important when encounter to nationalist assertions. What happens to transnational connections of migrations, alliances like what happened in Mexico in the 1920s, highlighting how sovereignty is negotiated and reimagined across borders. And these narratives underscore the importance of recognizing the agency of marginalized groups in shaping their own sovereign spaces. So the empire has become the new global order, as all of us understand now. The traditional imperialism that was characterized by the dominance of individual nation states have been replaced by a new form of global order that Hart and Negri calls as the empire. And this empire is not centered on any single nation now. In one discussion with Slavoj Zizek, Varoufakis talks about the old archaic idea of a left imagination would be to take over Facebook and nationalize it. But which nation will control Facebook? Facebook has grown beyond nation. Google has grown beyond nation. The nationalization, such old paradigms of shifts and changing economic paradigms to suit people are also not the need of the hour. In the sense, like things have changed so drastically, we need a deterritorialized network of power that operates on a global scale and also run by the multitude of the individuals with a social agency. That is very important for us to understand. And in this regard, we also understand that how the social life, the everyday life is configured. In the age of empire, as we know, the power is exercised not only through economic and political means, but also through the regulation and control of human life. So, in this scenario, how do we forge resistance and a culture of counter empire? And I welcome all of you to engage in this discussion and all the participants. I welcome all of you to listen to the three speakers. And thank you, Shafina. Thank you, Mina. Thank you, Malavika, for inviting me and being a part of this journey to realize imperial silhouettes. So I invite Bibi to go first and share your thoughts.
Hi, Sanjesh. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to listening to everybody speak. I will start my presentation with a little bit of a context to my site, since I've been obsessively been working there. I've been there for the last 4.5 years. It's a small shrine in the narrow streets of a mohalla in Lahore. Mohalla is a dense neighborhood formation that is said to house the graves of 6 women of the Prophet Muhammad's household, one of them being the daughter of Hazrat Ali, Bibi Ruqayya. Though this claim is contested, it remains the most popular one and places Lahore at the center of the Islamic geography within this region. This shrine is currently the second highest revenue generating shrine for the Awqaf department. The Awqaf department is a government institute with which most shrines of Punjab fall under. Because of its regional and national importance, the overall strategy is to increase religious tourism, to bring more affluent classes to the shrine, and to ultimately bring more capital. Within all of this, my work looks at the linkages between the hieroglyphies and discourses of Bibi Ruqayya, the saint, and her companions, and the everyday conversations in her shrine as it goes under major renovation for 3 years. It's been a year since it's back open, and I have been going there as a habit now, and it's because I have great connections there, lovely people, and also to continue observing and collecting stories in the new structure and new system of administration, and to see how things have changed and what is being resisted. Since this kind of renovation is taking place across Punjab in most of the shrines, this has become a very important sort of gateway for me to understand the power dynamics that are shifting. It is said that a little bit about Bibi Ruqayya herself. It is said that Bibi Ruqayya and her companions brought the message of Islam to the Indian subcontinent. They were the first people. They came to Sindh after they escaped from the event of Karbala from Medina. They came to Sindh, then from Sindh to Lahore in 88 Hijri, which is where she was eventually confronted by the Hindu king and is said to have requested God to take her out of sight. The ground ruptured and she and her companions were taken underground. Now, coming back to this moment when I walked in one day during the construction phase of this new shrine, I made a field note that I would like to read out for you. This was the scene in front of me that you see right now. The architect, who is a dear friend of mine, he was there as well. He was very proud of the fact that we had framed this tree within these frames, within these arches. I saw this and I made this note, and I would like to read that out. This was November 2022. The rhetoric of exploitation is often about materiality, about taking peoples or nature and remodeling them to appease a range of material fantasies. In Bibi's Mazar, the shrine, there are two beautiful one trees. One is the Punjabi name for a tree that you see right now in front of you, an ancient tree, that are said to be there much before any activity began. In some narratives, they are physical remnants of Bibi's cloak, as she never died or was buried here, but instead disappeared underground. And this tree that you see is what was left of her chadar, of her dupatta, of her veil. According to this, the zari, which is the grave of the shrine of the saint, becomes merely a symbolic architectural element, whereas the trees become the true markers of Bibi's ghaibat. Ghaibat means absence, and also her forever hazir, which means present state. Sada Mawjood, a term often used here, means always present but not in sight. The architectural firm, which is responsible for the reconstruction of the shrine, has given the trees quite a central place in their design and have fought to protect them passionately. But by the very system within which large architectural projects are set up, in contrast to a piecemeal fashion in which the existing shrine was constructed by the community and various parties of interest over the years, with, auto-constructed, with collecting chanda or money financing from different devotees over many years, this would mean this was a different case altogether. The shrine was shut down and the construction started from the scratch. No public was involved. This would mean, in the case of the trees, the nature would have to be framed within the proposed design planning, a practice that ultimately, in return for granting protection, looks towards nature to perform to its utmost defined role. For this, a case for the trees has to be made. The tree's purpose has to be defined, calculated, weighed, argued, and fought for in courts and meetings held with interest parties and stakeholders. The mystifying ancient one trees that many visitors come to sit under, consume the leaves of, to conceive and touch, remain there, but now the arches around them stand taller, and the same tree that hovered above the grave of the saint and was the tallest in the haram now has more than 100 feet high dome towering above. Though I am thankful that the trees are protected, this protection comes with a cost, and the cost is well immeasurable, and let's just say yet to be felt. End note. So this was November 2022, and this was after the architect had proudly and also rightfully had fought to protect the tree, because the people who were financing this project, the parties who were financing this project, wanted a concrete slab over the courtyard, which was to air condition it, which would mean that the trees would have to be cut down and removed. But he fought for it. But a summer later, the tree had started to wither away. There are 2 trees, by the way. Despite the computer-generated sun diagrams and wind calculations made to protect the tree initially, the mystical tree, defying all logics, soon turned into a carcass. A few days before the opening of the shrine, the carcass seemed like an eyesore inside the glorious new structure. Those financing the project ordered it to be removed from its roots. The space was cleared up, it was tiled up, and no traces of the tree were left, completely uprooted. The day when it was being cut down, I showed up, and someone I had befriended at the gate, they just let me in secretly. I became the only witness at this point. I felt I was there for a reason. I had to tell the story. The tree has become a symbol for me of those bodies that give and give and give, and when they're not of any use, are discarded ruthlessly. This is the story of colonization, the story of colonized bodies, colonized land, colonized culture, colonized nature. The tree was like a mother to many. Her leaves were consumed for medicinal qualities and for the fulfillment of material and spiritual desires, especially a desire for god bharai. God bharai is when you ask for a child and you conceive one. The day the news of the cutting of the tree reached everyone, this is before the tree was actually cut down, Rehana, who is the Jhadukash caretaker of the grave of baby, Jhadukashi is involves sweeping of the floor, acts of devotional care and rituals of love and care and maintenance around the shrine. And in some cases, especially in Rehana's cases, it is also an occupation that is a paid occupation and contractual. However, the other women are not under contracts or they're not paid, and they do it out of will and devotion. Rihanna is also, this woman is also the highest in status in the internal hierarchy of the shrine workers, and is also a spiritual leader of sorts. This is the first time I'm publicly sharing her photo after asking her permission, of course. As the other Jhadukash women, the workers of the shrine, sat around the tree, she took an old dried branch of a tree and burnt it with a diya. Diya is a small clay lamp. And then from my perspective, from my very emotional, watery eyes, I saw her swing that branch around the space, filling it up with the scented smoke of the one tree. I asked Rihanna, what is it that you're doing, Rihanna? Can I be a part of this? And I was wondering if this ritual too means something, if it comes from generational knowledge, and if she would tell me something. She said she had absolutely no idea what she just did. She said she is trying to remain present and she is merely saying goodbye. This is the first time Rihanna didn't act out of conviction and determination, but just absolute, like out of the moment. The level of care and love with which the system works at the level of the Jhadukash and the workers of the shrine is what makes this place Bibiyan Pak Daman for me. That ritual that was invented in that moment to make us all come together, to cry together, and to inhale her last scent. I believe none of us present there will ever forget that moment. a kind of distrust for the workings of the established system, and a kind of trust for Rihanna and for that system, internal system, was forged at that moment in that scene. That moment was so crucial since it started many conversations that people were not really having, mainly how alien the new system is to the old rhythms. And Rihanna's performative ritual that emerged from that moment of rupture, in a way, also consolidates the spirit of the people's infrastructure of care, which is in place for centuries. This is Rihanna for me. She comes in all of my paintings. The three paintings that I show in Abu Dhabi are paintings that are very deeply contextualized, nuanced story about a small shrine in a small neighborhood tucked far away in this world, for especially the audience in Abu Dhabi. But it becomes a mirror for all stories of grief and loss. A grief in which nature, a tree, becomes the main character. I tell this story of the tree that goes also in the state of occultation, ghabat. You can't really lose a tree such as this. It goes out of sight, but it doesn't go out of mind. These paintings that I made are also made out of my own anxieties because I was so attached to this tree myself. I painted it in all my paintings. It was always there as a witness, but then somehow I have become a witness of its death. I also get very emotional when I talk about it. And it goes, these paintings are also in consideration to the regret of the architect. For the architect for thinking he was protecting the tree, for thinking he could outsmart the mystery nature embodies. I also consider his grief in my paintings. His grief is similar to mine. His grief is also very telling of what it is that we are in relation to these immortal beings, these immortal places. And in this painting, this is one of my biggest piece. I add this verse from a poet, Mir Anis. It goes like this. Anis dam ka bharosa nahi ठहर जाओ. Anis dam ka bharosa nahi ठहर जाओ. चिराग लेके कहाँ सामने हवा के चले. Mir Anis is a contemporary of Ghalib, and his poetry is largely tied to lamentations, songs of bravery against the face of fascism. And I will give you like a literal meaning of this verse, and there's so many interpretations, you can make your own. There's so many interpretations out there. Every time I've asked somebody, there's a new way of looking at it. It basically means you don't have to stand in a windstorm to put the light of a diya out. A diya is a small lamp that is lit in the shrine. It takes a mere mortal human breath to put it out. That's how gentle the moment of light is. And that's how precarious our relationship to nature is and to these kinds of places. These stories keep the saint alive in the streets of Lahore by reinventing and reimagining her with the changing times and changing physical environment. My work shows a world constructed by the stories of women, stories that do not make headlines or find mentions in books, but weave the nuances and complexities of being a woman in Lahore into their devotion. This is a female saint in a city. This is something to keep in mind. This is a female saint in a city which houses one of the most iconic and celebrated male Sufi saints of the region, Data Ganjbakhsh, Moj Darya, Madhulal, Mia Mir. Yet in the last 2 decades or so, it has become a place that has made Bibi Ruqayya's name a key saint in Lahore, modern Lahore. This is also another picture of Rihanna I thought I'd share. This is the tree under which most of us sat. And this is how obsessively I painted the tree before when it was there. And this is what the tree has been replaced with. And some sketches of the tree that I made. And this is the dome, the magnificent, glorious dome that has replaced the beloved tree. Thank you.
Thank you, Bibi. Your work, especially in this context, is very important for me to highlight few important points. One is the binary of nature culture that dominates in the ecological discussions right now, throughout, even in the decolonial practices, and which we have to kind of do away with, which is a very fraught relation that has been imposed on all the post-colonial nations. And it's also in relation to the states of exception that we are maintaining, the kind of the reproduction of spaces, the control of spaces that were also part of colonial order, how the post-colonial regimes continue to practice that and impose those order, redrawing spaces, redrawing space, also sometimes erasing minor cultures, spaces that are a threat to the mainstream ideas of memory, official memory making, and taking away control from these self-determined spaces where this group of women are taking care of this particular site. So we will discuss that in detail, and I think it will also connect to what Sian also has to talk about his own engagement with the politics of land, and also the memories of colonialism, the memories of violence that accompanies, and the redrawings of the maps that have been done in various parts of the world. So I invite Sian to please continue the presentation after Bibi.
Thanks, Pranjesh. I'm honored to be part of this roundtable. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Bibi, for that very moving presentation. I will try to continue this conversation, also centered about the image and the archetype, or the metaphor also of a tree. But yes, can you see my slides? All good.
Yes, we can. All good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm Cian. I'm an artist based in Manila, Philippines. The Philippines is an archipelago in Southeast Asia. We have 7,400 islands. I'm showing you the slide of an infographic map. As you can see in the heading, it's a large land holdings amidst peasant landlessness. So quite immediately, it presents this contradiction of land in the Philippines, wherein about 70 to 75% of the population is within the peasant sector, which means they are involved in like production, food production, and agriculture. This includes like farm workers and small farmers, and fisher folk and indigenous communities who are stewards of their own respective ancestral domains. Yet 7 out of 10 of these people, these populations within the peasant sector remains landless, and this is due to land monopoly brought about by centuries of colonialism, from 300 years of Spanish and 50 plus years of America, who's never really left because of neoliberal policies that persist until today. So a lot of my work largely speaks about this legacy of colonialism and how, how its violence is systematized and is experienced within grassroots communities, particularly in the hinterlands, but also within the urban centers of the Philippine archipelago. So quite immediately put into question is the sovereignty and linkages and questions of contested notions of democracy within this nation. So here in this infographic, you see um, a selection of largest land holdings from political dynasties and oligarchs and multinational corporations who own and control large swaths of land, particularly for different real estate ventures and mineral extraction and agribusiness plantations. which connects to a lot of the work that I do as an artist and an activist and also a geographer. I spend a lot of time working with different communities within the countryside to facilitate workshops on how to make maps or counter maps, um, wherein participants get the time to think about their space and author representations of their lived environment in relation to access to resources and services, but at the same time in relation to their experiences of displacement and militarization and land grabbing, which is a historical scenario. So here, I've been doing this since 2017 or so, about the same time as when the administration of Rodrigo Duterte started. Um, there were several like peasant massacres within the countryside, um, of landless peasants that were trying to assert their rights to land. So these images that you see are samples that were made by different indigenous groups and workers' unions, and farm workers, narrating their spaces, and also showing instances of human rights abuses and displacement. Here they can also somehow enumerate the perpetrators, which are mostly state forces and private armies that are controlled by large corporations and oligarchs that are continuing to displace them and take control of the land. So these workshops that I have been doing started out initially as a branch of my research practice in terms of like like artistic production, wherein I would try to somehow connect the narratives of these different communities from the basic masses, these sectors, and try to create objects. So at the same time, like my participation as a contemporary artist also recognizes that contemporary art is in itself a contested platform, um, which brings a lot of contradictions with like how we participate within these social movements at the same time, how contemporary art is very much dictated by whims of um, markets. So a lot of the work that happens in the studio take the form of paintings and tapestries such as these. But mostly, initially, they were responding to European feudal tapestries that represent images and scenes of territory and property and estates. But at the same time, I try to make objects that act like anti-feudal objects, wherein they um, represent the space that is um, from the lens of the people who are actually living in it. As we recognize that maps are like overtly political objects that has been historically a tool for occupation and conquest and colonialism, which are always authored by states and corporations and other centralized bodies. In these objects, the perspectives of the marginalized communities are highlighted and foregrounded as a main source of all the data and information and narratives that are used in the maps that we make collectively with the communities and my collaborators. Um, we also use the sources and reports from different rights organizations and mass organizations from different regions in the Philippines and alternative media. And these can be accessed with QR codes that are sewed onto the maps as a somewhat of a reference or bibliography. So here in these two samples of map tapestries showing the Central Luzon region and the Cordillera region in the Philippines, we highlight different aggressive infrastructure projects and the military presence, also mentioning like paramilitary groups that are being used by corporations. At the same time, largest land holdings and mineral extraction in the area. But then these also also to note that like these maps are like in a way static documents that talk about a specific place within a specific time. They also embody like centuries and um, ongoing events that are still happening today. So connecting um, the past and different formulations of a revolutionary future, if you will. Somehow looking at these as anti-feudal objects, it also kind of um, resists kind of being stuck within the given platforms of museums and galleries in a way, as I try to constantly activate the pieces by traveling them around, and them taking the format of textile pieces allows them to be folded and literally smuggled out of the country, and around also I guess um to get away from the bureaucracy and the corruption of Philippine customs. So in a way, like I try to like flirt with this idea of a nomadic object that can somehow um, jump into different contexts and I guess like exhibitions, but at the same time, um, do the political work of forming solidarities across different spaces. Um, as these are like in the case of this exhibition, they found themselves in Abu Dhabi, conversing and speaking to the other pieces and the other contexts and the other stories of struggle and also the audiences there. So these two tapestry maps are showing two haciendas or large land holdings from within the central Luzon region. The one on the left is Hacienda Luisita, which is like 6,400 hectares, which is owned and controlled by the local political dynasty, the Coangco Aquinos, who has had two presidents within this family. In 2004, there was a large contingent of farm workers that were asserting their rights to the land for land reform. But then they were met with violence by state forces, and then there was a massacre of farm workers. So this event, known as the Hacienda Luisita Massacre, which happened in 2004, is also quite, I guess, like instrumental into my formation as an artist and an activist. I was in high school when this happened, and hearing this story somehow like led me to like pursue these questions, and um, finding different groups to work with, to learn and understand, and somehow dismantle this kind of systemic historical oppression. And fast forward to 2022, um, Hacienda Tinang is a smaller hacienda in Tarlac that also is controlled by a local political dynasty. So a large contingent of us, different cultural workers and activists and advocates, also including like foreign scholars and media people, came in solidarity with the farm workers, who are also agrarian reform beneficiaries actually. So they had like the legal rights and literally the papers to claim their land, but then these were still being um, grabbed and enforced by the local politicians. So they had activated and utilized the state forces to detain our large contingent, and we were given like criminal charges, which we had to somehow fight for about a year or so. But after a while, after a rather long legal battle, they have been installed within their land. So I think it's also important to note the importance of the formations of social movements in terms of organizing within grassroots communities and forming alliances within different sectors, like cultural sector and other individuals and organizations within um, within different disciplines to make noise and be in solidarity with uh, with the farm workers and the with the peasant sector. So a lot of it is actually about the fight for genuine agrarian reform to to resist systemic landlessness brought by um, monopoly of land, which equates to power in the Philippines. And taking a step back and thinking about like monopoly of land and narrative. So I'm showing here like a series of tapestries that use photographs from the American Times. These photographs were taken by Dean Worcester in early 1900s. So Dean Worcester was a colonial administration within American occupation. And he took a lot of photographs showing flora and fauna of the Philippines and the people from all over the archipelago, which he brought back to the US and used to campaign against granting the Philippines early independence. So these images are very instrumental in framing the imaginary of the Filipino people as savage and barbaric and unable to govern themselves, which justified further colonial rule to neo-colonial or what we also recognize as semi-colonial conditions that still happen today. So in these tapestries, I would work with my embroiderer collaborator to annotate on these objects, annotate words and images that talk about and literally like explicitly try to spell out the different conditions um, that are being experienced by indigenous people and farmers and workers and the urban poor in the Philippines. So some of the images that are annotated and embroidered like take the form of um like policies or words and or chants like protest chants and also kind of talismanic imagery that is borrowed or assimilated from different quasi-religious folk Catholic iconography, which also has been used in a lot of revolutionary groups. So the you can also recognize that the Communist Party of the Philippines and the main anti-imperialist body is also within the genealogy of early anti-colonial revolts around against the Spanish who were in control from 1500s to late 1800s. So interesting to see the visual, the genealogy and lineage of visual vocabulary um, and narratives that are being used from Christianity to anti-colonial to anti-imperialist revolts within resistance and movements. So here is one such example of one of these tapestry maps, and at the bottom you'd see like different, I guess like from kind of like a rhizomatic logic, different like forms or gestures or phenomenon of resistance or advocacy, such as like protracted People's War and class analysis. So, but taking a step back and also somewhat of a reflection of the work that is there in Abu Dhabi, I'm taking into consideration this archetype of the tree of life, which is very much used within different cultures. Like here, you see examples within like Kabbalah, Norse, but at the same time, like this formation of hierarchical logic is very much within like broad archetypal um, logic of history, which led me to make different iterations of this tree of life and death um, from the perspective of like Philippine history, wherein we consider imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism as the roots of I guess like of hardship of the Filipino masses. So you could say that this is a series that is constantly evolving into different iterations. The one that's in on view in the gallery was made in 2019. And as you can see, it's also my way of trying to map out and understand like the interconnectedness of 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 these larger ideas into the experiences of the grassroots. I mean, when you talk to indigenous communities or farmers, it's not often the case that they understand like notions of neoliberal policy within their um, everyday experience. So at the same time, like the different versions of this tree drawing becomes my way, and I guess like other people around me who are also comrades to understand like these networks of power. I didn't really have like more images, but then this is a drawing that is um a little bit more updated, if you will, which I guess I'm also just continuing the subversion of this motif of Tree of Life, but at the same time recognizing that as they are present within embroidery in textile that travels from different museum to gallery to museum to gallery to collection to museum to gallery, I also try to find ways on how the images um, travel outside the conventional spaces of art, and how like my practice and other people's practices of cultural work, of image making, of cultural production um, is aligned with social movements. I think this is the core of what I want to really say in this presentation, is the importance of how we use our practices in terms of being in solidarity with the most marginalized population, and at the same time find our struggles within their struggles as one and the same. So I guess like this slide is presented as such because they do also come out in protest material, in stickers, and in other reproducible formations that can be like evolved further by other people and try to use. So yeah, that's it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. And again, to build on Bibi and your presentation, uh, I think if we look at something that could generalize us in the global south right now, it would be the emboldened protests that are going across the world against resource extraction that is everywhere now. And one of the important paradox of our age is that even the movement to replace fossil fuels requires another round of mining. That means more control on land, more claim and forceful acquisition of land. And how to facilitate, and the important problem is how to facilitate this extraction that is necessary without continuing on the path of endless accumulation. And it's not a good picture what we see, as said by Thea Rio Francus in an interview. And he says that we are not really in an energy transition or into moving towards some kind of sustainable energy future, which is promised to us and is popularly understood. What we are in a period of major energy addition, in which both fossil fuels and renewable sources are growing at a rapid rate, at a rapid change here. And it's also important to remember that when we look at human history and how human history is periodized, it is according to the tools of our ancestors mined from the earth, whether it's the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. It's framed according to our own relation, the extractional relation, the transactional relation with the earth. And culture, since the beginning, in that way, is also intermittently connected with extraction. And the first things that were mined, the first materials that were mined by hominids they were the red ochre and other concentrated pigments. And they responded to the godlike cataclysms that were around them, the floods, shooting stars, and all, by searching the depths below for colors with which they could mark their skin and animal hides and everything. And when we look at the history of mining itself, it has been noted that no one before modern times entered a mine except as a prisoner of war, a criminal, or a slave. And they were all forcefully entering into mine. It's a modern industry that, especially with the arrival of European colonial expansion, that continues the influx of this institutionalized slavery of willing people, willing workers going inside the mines. The silver and gold mines of the Americas under the Spanish court's command became hubs of exploitation. And one important exhibition I would urge all of you to take a look at is, which has been hugely influential on my practice, is the Potosi Principle. That is an amazing exhibition that looks at the historical mining site of Potosi, but also in relation to the imposition or the importing of images, Christian images from Spain to Latin America, the imposition of Christianity onto Latin America through mass production of images. So, through that exhibition, what the curators are also trying to counter argue is that the mass production of images did not begin with modernity as we imagine with the arrival of mass culture, mass industry. It began with the pre modern society with the act of mining and extraction. So, the extraction cycle of this boom and bust, discovery, exploiting, exhausting, new discoveries have become part of our life, and it has been affecting the disenfranchised people more and more everywhere. And in this regard, it's also very important to note that when we are constantly attacking colonialism for this, we also have to go back to pre colonial times to understand our own fraught relations with land. That again, we did not enjoy a harmonious, equal relation with land throughout. It has always been in control. Like again, there are various spectrums of ecological discourses that argue that, oh, let's go back to that old times where things were shared together, things were produced together. Let's go. And there are a lot of practices also in contemporary art, as all of you know, that romanticizes agriculture. There's nothing to romanticize agriculture and farming until unless you own the land, you own the means of production. And this is something we need to understand. So I invite Wambui for the final presentation today, and let's continue the discussion.
Thank you so much for having me for this conversation. It opens up so many different angles when it comes to considering how colonialism and neocolonialism all exist in this particular spectrum and in this particular time. So my presentation is about Showa Showa, which is the piece that is showing at Riskat. And it's taken from a larger installation piece that was called Wakariro. I borrow this quote by H.E. Crocker that says that the problem of the crew children will require a solution in the near future for it is only to be expected that they will imbibe Mau Mau teaching with their mother's milk. So Mau Mau was the revolutionary army that fought against colonialism, and at some point was classified as a psychological disease. And so there was a great fear that the disease of Mau Mau would be spread across society and would make it difficult for the Europeans, the British, who were settled in Kenya, to continue to exist. So my work proceeds from this idea that the trauma of colonialism is passed from generation to generation, and I carry the burden of colonialism as well. I'll play a short video so we can see what Showa Showa is. Thank you. So that particular clip is a compression of what the entire video is that was on show. It is on show at Risk Art. That particular clip is about a solitary figure who is in some ways androgynous, who presents a letter to Monuments of Colonial History demanding information about the burial of the remains of one of the fighters from Mau Mau, so Dedan Kimathi. And along with it, it is a request, more like a demand, I should say, a demand for cultural artifacts, for materials related to identity, for the theft of not just the resources, the people, but also the time, the loss of language, and the loss of identity that was caused by the interruption that is colonialism. And it fits directly into what is said about by Crocker, that the greatest fear is that the Mau Mau will be imbibed in breast milk to mothers, from mothers to children. Showa Showa was part of Wakariro, so I'll show you a little bit about Wakariro. Wakariro is this installation that borrowed images, or I could say items that are related to Kikuyu culture, which is my ethnic group. In this particular installation, I had my grandmother's cooking shed, which is this blue hut. And the idea was to create something that is familiar to a lot of people. This hut is symbolic of feminism because it's a space where women feel free to have conversations, where women and young girls have access to this space. Young boys up to a certain point, but then after some point, they're not allowed in. And it's a place where women have conversations about what's happening in society. You know, so-and-so's husband is beating her. How do we help her? How do we fundraise for this particular instance where, you know, we're trying to build a church or whatever it is? The conversations happen in that particular space. The other conversations that have happened in the past in that particular space is how women can be involved in the independence war. Now, unfortunately, what has happened, or as is expected, the people who have written about the colonial history, mostly from a Western lens, write about it from their angle of victory. And what is lost in that silence is the fact that women were very important towards the independence war. So Showa Showa was projected on the three sides of this kariko, which is this structure, this outside structure. And when you look at it in Risk Art, it is on 4 screens. The feeling being that you are trapped in a box and having to go from place to place, which is what the journey towards recovering cultural identity sometimes has felt like. Access to archives are not necessarily easily provided for me as an African. To be able to get to archives in Europe or in America, I need a visa to access those. Then I need letters of permission, and I need to say why I'm going into those archives. So this entrapment is a continued source of discomfort, of disorientation, and the projection of it on the kariko meant that you'd go around and you'd have that experience of just going round in circles. The inside of the kariko had those items that I said that were taken from my grandmother's hut. It's an exact replica of her hut. And you can tell it is a space that is a woman's empowerment space. It's not just a place where you go and cook, but it's a place where you go and have conversations. Within the installation, I also had the song that you heard play, which is Showa Showa. And it is a woman who is singing to a young girl to come and meet her because she's come from collecting firewood. And she's saying, I have no one to come and meet me. So Wakariro, please come and hurry and get me so you can take the firewood and take it to the house. And in some ways, the solitary figure who is in the video is meeting the past generation and continuing the search and the fight against oppression. So Showa Showa is that action of the past, the present, meeting the future, to carry on the baton to fight against oppression and to continue the search for an identity that they have been robbed of. Within the installation, I also included 12 women who had fought in the war. Again, this is a history that is obscured women's roles are taken as minor. But then if women were not part of the Mau Mau War, then the Mau Mau would not have been successful. So they were in charge of providing food. They were also in charge of providing weaponry that was taken from cities and put into baskets, like the one that the solitary figure in the video is carrying. And those baskets would be filled with food and then taken to the edge of the forest. So these 12 women are just a sample of from a small region, but they remain faceless. And you can see that their faces instead filled by the borders that were instituted by colonialism. However, their identities are present within the particular pieces in terms of their name and their role. So it's like a wall of fame, I guess, of these women who made it possible for independence to happen in Kenya. Also within that particular video, there are images of Mau Mau war fighters. And these are not images that are necessarily available in history books or available when you talk about Kenyan colonialism or the fight against colonialism. The images you often get are images of fighters arrested or imprisoned, the images that show the victor's perspective. However, these images, which are available, but only available when accessed through an archive, also show the fighters who are proud. And in some of them, you have women as well in the photographs. And the reason that these images were taken by the fighters was because they wanted to be able to write their own history. And the interesting thing that happened is each time that the British captured an area, they also stole the archival materials that the soldiers had created. So these archival materials would be stocks of how much ammunition they had used, what had happened that day, and most importantly, photographs with the names of the people who had fought. Because one day they knew that they'd come out of the forest and they would write their history. These materials were denied initially, the British initially denied having these materials until about the early 2000s when they were sued by former Mau Mau veterans. And then once that they revealed that they actually had these documents, which were taken from Kenya at the point of colonialism, they then decided that through the archives that the items could only be released in a staggered way. So it's almost every 5 years or so new documents are released, such to the point that there are some documents that will not be released until 2030, the idea being to avoid embarrassment to the crown. So my question in my video piece is, who are these people and what are their names? What did they have to endure in order to come to this place to fight? And who are their families? So Wakariro is also about the loss of language. And within it, there is conversation between my grandmother and myself, my daughter and me. And what we're discussing is the naming of particular beads. And the conversation between my grandmother and me, where she names the beads, you can tell what the beads are for based on the name. So you can tell what the bead is for, how to plant it, how it tastes in some cases. But then when you translate it to English, which is the conversation between my daughter and me, you find that the use is lost because there's no other definition for the word bead in English. And what I was demonstrating through that conversation is that over 3 generations, the loss of language has meant that my daughter will not have access to her history because much of this history was passed down by oral methods. And without that access, then it means that she loses knowledge of herself and her identity. And so it's become very important for me in the last few years to be able to access the archives. This last year, I managed to complete a residency that had me visiting archives in the US, three archives, to look at Kikuyu artifacts that are there that had been spread during after colonialism. And it was impressive to see the materials that are there, but also very sad because some of the materials had degenerated because the conditions in which the museums were keeping them are not the conditions in which those items were created. So for example, leather skins that were degenerating because the people who created them for use and had particular ways of preserving them. So using castor oil or whatever it is, but the museums were keeping them in, temperature controlled, humidity controlled spaces. And what struck me about that is the way in which museums continue to say that they are the keepers of this knowledge. However, even with being the keepers of this knowledge, sometimes what happens is these museums are not able to maintain or preserve these materials for future generations. So it's almost like the argument for repatriation, which is made that, if we send these items back to the people, they won't know what to do with them, is wrong, because the people who made these items are the same people who have the knowledge on how to preserve these items. So through my current work, I have decided to go back, not just to the Mau Mau era and not just the colonial period, but to the pre-colonial period, and try and figure out, for example, where the Kikuyu came from. So it involves looking at maps of Africa from the 1500s or earlier, trying to figure out what East Africa in particular, where the Kikuyu are said to be mostly based, what that looked like before the borders. The idea being to try and figure out how far back I could go towards realizing about the origin of the Kikuyu. And what I have also realized through that search is that because English is a limiting language, because it creates barriers, it means that at some point, even the utility of English is rendered useless, because some of the documentation is in Arabic, or is in Greek, and it's held by older civilizations. And it made me understand that even by virtue of the fact that English is the language that we use to communicate, it reduces how much knowledge we have access to. And I have come to realize as well that it's important for us to be able to tap into into older civilizations in order to extract the knowledge that is held in those older civilizations, in order to come to an understanding of what it means to be Kikuyu. I feel as well, by looking at the archives, there's a lot that can be gleaned in terms of innovation. So for example, I came across a stick broom, which is called an ufagio. And this stick broom from the 1800s has remained unchanged to the point where you can still find this particular broom here in Nairobi without much of a change to its design. And it made me think about the fact that when we talk about innovation, we talk about it in the context of capitalism, that capitalism drives innovation. But by looking at this broom from the 1800s and seeing that I can actually still purchase the same broom, it made me understand that innovation is the creation of an item and the perfection of that item. And it does not necessarily have to exist within capitalism, because capitalism simply tweaks something that works in order to sell it at a higher price to the next buyer. And I think there's a lot of that can be gleaned from our archives, not just what items do the people use, but also the philosophies of a particular ethnic group or a particular peoples. But unfortunately, in order to access that, then you have to also understand the language. So I'm very interested in ways in which we could preserve these languages so that we could also preserve the history. And I think that is it for my presentation.
Thank you, Bambu. And I think at the outset, it has huge relevance for the Indian context too, especially in the context where I come from, the state, where there is this what you call this is foregrounding of an ideal woman. In Malayalam, in my language, we call it as Sakulastri. She's like the ideal woman, who is a tamed and controlled woman who should be part of the social movements, but should also be restrained, should also obey the patriarchal normative order. And here, with the reclamation of this particular narrative of the Kikuyu women, who and their role, their important role in the Mau Mau struggle for independence, which was also, I think, was neglected a great deal because of the fact that there was immense amount of oral data that was available, but it was all neglected, and then studies had to reclaim that how the Kikuyu woman played an important, critical, and decisive role in the shaping up of the Mau Mau rebellion, and without their active cooperation and assistance, the movement would not have been as effective, especially in terms of its logistics, operation, recruitment, and everything. And you have also opened up a very important discussion about repatriation, the return to the community. And again, when we talk about repatriation, we usually find Europe as the villain, or the white museum houses as the villains who have taken over the custody of our heritage and artifacts. But it's also about that state of exception that is maintained even in the post colonial times, about the contestant question of who owns the heritage, what heritage has to be shown, and what memory has to be shown, and what memory should not be shown, and who is civilized enough to take care of that thing, which is also in BB's presentation. We have seen how a group of women try to take care of a particular monument, but throughout their efforts, they are always thwarted and attacked and oppressed to perform that task. So, in this scenario, let's start with few questions, and I'll also urge the participants to type in their questions, and I'll read out to that to the speakers here. But Babu, you can start. The first point to discuss today is about reclamation, which is an important process in all of your practice. And it's also an important decolonial strategy too. So I want to understand the specific ways in which you practice the act of reclamation as a process, as a material, as a method in your own practices. So Bambu, you can start, and then Sian and Bibi, you can also respond to that.
Thank you for that very deep and complex question, Prabjesh. I I like to refer to Walter Rinaldo's theorizing when it comes to the idea of decoloniality. And I think sometimes what happens is we conflict decoloniality with decolonization. And I choose to use Walter Mignola's definition where he says that in spite and despite of colonialism, we are now creating new identities. We're creating identities that take into consideration that we have existed before colonialism, during colonialism, and after colonialism. Whereas decolonization being the process where we remove what is colonial and we try and replace it with what we believe is a definition of ourselves. And I think my work fits into the conversation about decoloniality because I am trying to express myself as an African woman in a world where it's actually a lot smaller, where I'm interconnected to other people like yourselves through the internet who have had similar experiences around colonialism, where I can borrow Sian's tapestry and build upon that when it has come to conversations about how colonialism continues to affect us today. Where I can look at Bibi's work and look at how women in the past have been caretakers of history. So my work about reclamation is more in tune to creating places for knowledge or spaces for knowledge. My installations are really not about answering questions, but about raising and creating spaces for audiences to have conversations about what is difficult to remember. And here I use remember loosely, read and remember, to put back together. So to remember conversations or topics that are difficult. When I came back from school, I have a history background. When I came back from school, I wanted to teach at the university. And the dean of the history department said to me, why would I want to join a dying institution? And he was referencing that history no longer has a place in society in terms of education, in terms of society formation. So my installations are an answer to that question, an opportunity to have conversations about history, because I think going back to history is where we can reclaim our identities. It's where we can have conversations that allow us to form new memories and new identity that that bring together our memories in a way that takes into consideration that references may be archives or they may be oral sources.
Thank you, Bambar. BP, Sian.
Thanks, Mambui. Yeah, really great insights. Makes me think a lot about um, the very gesture of reclamation, which I think we can also kind of prime these inquiries of reclamation by trying to reclaim the meaning of reclamation. Like in the Philippines, like I guess like reclamation is more commonly used for literal land reclamation, wherein a lot of corporations are reclaiming land, for example, from the water to make way for private infrastructure, which should be um, public instead. So, or the idea of local governments reclaiming land from um, or taking custodianship of land for supposed greening projects, but instead plant endemic trees which they can then harvest for export. So this idea of reclamation is very much contested and at the same time utilized by the logic of occupation and conquest. But it's also very different if you view it as a revolutionary reclaiming firearms from the state forces and using it as a tool to for dignity. You know, so it then somehow reclaims the idea of reclamation. In the case of my work, wherein I use a lot of archival images, which were taken from American colonial administration, um, I actually did get access to these archives, and the first thing I said was that I've been stealing your images for a good few years now. And then they said, you know, come back tomorrow with a terabyte, and then like we'll give you copies. So it's interesting to find I guess allies within in some cases, in very particular cases, within these um caves, these archives, that are also trying to find meaning within the objects they claim custodianship with. So these images are not neutral at all. They are very violent. So like 5,000 images of colonial occupation, the mere intensity of its quantity is very unnerving and disturbing. But it's not just the ownership or the access to these images, but the capacity to understand and untangle the very matrix of this colonial violence, which has persisted for centuries. So I think I'd like to also kind of bring back the idea of different grassroots communities drawing maps of their own land based on their own experiences as a form of reclaiming authorship within within the representations of their space, um because like historically, like most representations of their space which everyone has been subscribing to was authored by state or positions of power, and um in the good few hours that they get to tell their stories and then they get to draw their own spaces, it's a way for them to start this long process of reclaiming authorship and um yeah, authorship and claim of land. So I also like the point that there's no such thing as romanticizing agriculture unless you own the land and owning the means of production. And this is basically it, is us reclaiming the means of production in terms of narrative and meaning.
I'd like to also add in my little comment on affirmative action versus ambiguity that exists in specifically the case of the shrine that I been sitting in and making friends in and documenting the lives of women in. The fact that there is on one side an shrine, a plan for an architecture plan that comes in from like the top, the shrine is shut down and the public is kept out and completely, the process is made completely undemocratic. And on the other side, the ambiguity of the saint Bibi Ruqayya herself, her own physical presence, and the ambiguity that creates it within the space allows a large margin for women to sort of fill in those spaces with imagination. So who is she, and physically who she was very unimportant. But what she, because she did most of her sermons were behind the veil. Most of the time when she moved, women from this era, women from this family, when they moved from, across the from Sindh to Punjab, when they moved, they were veiled, and most of the time they would change their names in different contexts. They would have different names, so they remained completely new. People would write about them, and people were talking about them. There are stories about them, but most of the time, the stories and the book, writing was done when the women had already moved along, so they had already passed by. So this kind of ambiguity that is created in who Bibi Ruqayya is, and the fact that she mirrors Bibi Zen, who is also a historical figure, and who reflects intellect and wisdom, and she brings in um, resistance and resilience, because she also moves from one place to another and takes the message of Islam. This kind of space that is created within the shrine allows women to put in their ideas and notions of what this place should be. And this kind of thing brings in a lot of different opinions. And this kind of conversation also starts when, for example, the architect would bring in his plans and the workers of the women would look at the plans and they would have a lot of comments on it. It felt that since they were the ones, the custodians of her imagination, custodians of her identity making, they felt that they should also have an opinion on how the space should be represented and how the space should represent her. And I think at some level, this kind of like reclaiming happens here because in this form of manner, because this is a woman who, so if you, this shrine is also a place which brings in a lot of pilgrims from the entire region. So there are different cultures and languages coming in. There is Marcia reading, there is Noha reading, there is a lot of storytelling that takes place here in different languages. So a lot of different kinds of cultures come together. And in different cultures, a heroic woman or a woman warrior or a woman intellectual has different shades. So there was no one way of having this building represent her. It was from the start a big disaster, in my opinion. And before the before this building came up, there was maintenance and there was architecture there. There was new construction happening, and that construction took place in this very sporadic way. And it was devotional, since, for example, there would be women sitting around, and someone would come up with a great idea to fix a tap that was broken, and she would just sit there, ask people for money, and whoever felt like they had a big prayer to make, they would give the biggest contribution. And that way the tap would be fixed. But the tap would not look like the tap next to it. It would look like a completely different tap. So there were like multiple different taps from different time zones next to each other. But what it suggested was that everyone has their own way of changing and maintaining and have the right to the space. And as we know, the right to change a space is the true right to a place. And so this is just something that I would say about the way this place functioned before something as big as the new order came up.
There are a few interesting questions from the audience for you. I think you guys could take that and answer that. There are two questions for you, Wambui, and one each for you, Sian and Bibi. So, Wambui, would you like to start? One is about, again, the complex. Yeah, please go ahead if you have already read the question, please. Uh,
Before I look at the questions, I'd like to
you
bring
want
up
to respond?
two interesting, things that have been said by both Bibi and Sian. Um, I like what Bibi is saying about how the women would get together and fix what needed to be fixed around the shrine, and how the item would not look the same as the new item would not look the same as the old item. And I think we have to be very careful about the sinister way in which we have accepted definitions of preservation when it comes to spaces, and to ask ourselves if that idea of preservation is related to colonial or Western perspective of what preservation is. Whereas for them, preservation is they must fix it in the exact same color and material that was held by that group of people. And I see that with things that have to do with my particular ethnic group, where language is dynamic, culture is dynamic. So even the repair of these spaces, I feel, should also be a definition of that dynamism. So there's nothing wrong with fixing something and the item is new. It's a marker of time so that someone else who comes after will be like, oh, so this was fixed in 1950 and this one, the original was from 1930. It just tells a story. So that whole process just tells a story about a place or a time. And then the other thing I want us to be very careful about is I know that we should not romanticize the idea of agriculture, but even when we talk about ownership of land, who does the land belong to? Is it an individual? Is it a community? Is it an ethnic group? Is it an area that just belongs to a group of people? Because the idea of land ownership by an individual is what had led to Mau actually happening. It was that bordering by white and British farmers that led to people saying, where are you taking our land? Because the land for the longest time had been for communal land. Or the idea of, because land doesn't seem to be in use, it has got no owner and therefore can be occupied and sealed off. So I have been questioning what those my perceptions or definitions of larger ideas are according to a Western lens or a colonial lens versus according to maybe how it worked for a community, which is what my ethnic group is. It was a communal society. I think I can look at the questions that have come in. Can I ask that Malavika probably ask the question and then we can respond?
I can do that. I can do that.
Okay.
Yeah. So first question is from Chala Truni. Your work navigates between personal memory and collective history, often uncovering hidden or overlooked narratives. As you create, how do you decide which stories to prioritize? And how do you ensure they resonate beyond their specific context to engage broader audiences? That's the first question. And
That first can I answer each as we go?
yeah, totally up to you. Yeah.
So I was actually having a conversation with a friend of mine about context this morning because I feel that my work is very Kenya specific. And I think through this exhibition, I have found that the questions I'm raising are actually questions that are being raised by other artists. I found a clique of people who are asking the same questions that I have had about my own artwork. And it's very difficult. It's very easy as an artist to ask, how do I create for a broader audience? And then get swallowed into this whole stream of creation that doesn't allow you to express what really matters to you. So, do I create for a broader audience? Not really. I create from the questions that I have. I start from the points of interest and then create from that. Now, if it doesn't have or it doesn't seem to have a broader audience context, then that's probably because the audience is not looking at how my stories are about human experience. And I think that's what artists do. They talk about human experience. So I think that answers that particular question.
Yeah, of course, of course. And let's go to the next question. Malvika has asked that. It's basically about touching on the limitations of English as our tool for expression. And how do each of the artists navigate these linguistic constraints in their practices? Do you find yourself reinterpreting, resisting, or expanding the language to better serve the histories and narratives you engage with?
All of the above, Malavika. All of the above. I think I think language is a tool, and I find that more recently I have started to incorporate words that come from my ethnic group within my work, not for any other reason, but because the way that the words are structured allow me to have deeper meaning. So I'll have the word in Kikuyu or in Kiswahili, and then I will have the translation or the loose translation in English, because again, uh, English for me, I'm finding more and more is limiting. Um, I am also finding that as I continue to do research, which my work is heavily based on, I'm going to need to find somebody who is an Arab speaker so that they can help me look at the materials, because I I can't stop at the fact that I can't access the materials because they're not written in a language that I understand, especially because those some of those materials hold my history. And by not accessing those materials, I'm only getting half of a story about me. So I'm beginning to see language as malleable as opposed to having borders. And I think I am quite happy about the fact that I am trilingual, to be able, quadrilingual, to be able to understand that I don't have to say something in one particular way, and therefore I don't have to see something in one particular way.
It's also interesting because even in the Indian context, when we are talking about the Dalit community, the former, the erstwhile untouchables, who were the lowest of the strata of the caste system, and the iconic leader of the Dalits, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is the architect of Indian Constitution, was educated in English. He did his PhD from Columbia, and Dalit movement strongly asserts the importance of learning English language in order to also seek social mobility, but also to liberate themselves from the traditional, archaic, the religious presence of languages. That many of these languages, in their what you call in their circulation, in their usage, are also tied with the old forms of religion, oppression, even in terms of its form, syntax, and usage. And the only way to also for them to connect with the global community of the oppressed, which is also the black community for them, where who they have maintained huge amounts of correspondence and everything, is through the English language. So they strongly assert that we should study English instead of going back to Sanskrit or Hindi or any sort of such languages.
I think to study is not to be at fault. It is to forget the other language that is the problem.
That has also been stated by this Malayalam writer Ayyappan, who is also coming from the same background. He said that in the pursuit of challenging the Hindu, the Brahminical dominance, many of the Dalits converted to Christianity. And what happened is that because of that, they let go of their culture, language, belief systems, and everything. So that is a paradox also of this. Bibi, Sian, would you like to take the questions?
I'm sorry, so sorry to interrupt, because
Yeah.
specifically in relation to like Fian's work, because he uses English words and text. And I kept thinking, when you're writing down physically in English, you're writing words like imperialism, you're writing words like resistance, power. What does it mean to reclaim, but also you are representing again the root maybe of all of these problems, and the fact that we're having this conversation in English, and like it's so tangled up in so many layers. Sorry, that was, yeah, so just very curious.
Yes, language definitely is malleable. I, as a Filipino, am in this imposition of like a colonial wiring of linguistics. Growing up speaking in Filipino, but growing up with CNN and BBC and Hollywood and American cartoons, hence the accent. I think in I think and I understand in Filipino English, in Taglish, which is very problematic, and you see that within like a generational framework as well. So I think it's also, I guess, the capacity to move within this malleability of wiring, um, being within, and it's also a very much a classed thing. So like acknowledging that I am a petty bourgeois, contemporary artist in Manila, working with communities in the countryside, is very much an important part of my practice. Um, Nodding and in recognition that my work and my contribution um, within this visual discourse is part of a larger tradition or framework or genealogy of visually articulating or culturally articulating historical resistance movements. So I think like bleeding on to the question of fact and fiction, it is also somehow overridden or like sort of like a like the idea of perspective like overrides the binary of fact and fiction, and at the same time looking at accuracy and imagination, historical accuracy and artistic imagination, not not as opposites but rather like a as a continuation. So by historical accuracy, we can only really reclaim our past and futures by um, finding shared imaginaries of future in a way. So I never really somehow like divided the idea of like um, my own artistic imagination into my work, but rather saw my positionality and my practice as an extension or a tool for the collective voices of different communities. But specifically speaking, my work somehow extends existing campaigns for social justice and human rights in the Philippines. So it's not about like making up these different stories that you just choose out of convenience, but rather sort of taking on existing political calls um, based on specific issues and specific regions that um, you work with. So I think it's somehow kind of all um, all connects this idea of um, recognizing positionality and recognizing one's practice as part of a larger genealogy of work, which is yeah, which I activate my English Filipino language wiring of my head into the visuals that I make.
Okay, well, in my case, I had to stop thinking entirely in English. I had to um, go back to my mother tongue, which I had also stopped speaking after my grandmother passed away because she was the only one who was speaking Punjabi. And for me to really grasp the imagination of Bibi Rukaiya while I sit with the women who talk about her in various different ways, I have to I have to speak that language. I have to speak the language of the women there, and that's also my language, obviously. And in many ways, I don't really enjoy writing about my work. I don't like talking about my work as such as well, because I feel like it's become very difficult. I've internalized so much of that place and of the kind of stories that are told there in that language, in the language of the place. Of course, there are different languages spoken there. In fact, the storytelling, like I just mentioned, is in various different kinds of, various different Pakistani languages that are spoken there in that space. But when I think about painting what I observed on the site when I go back home, I try to completely take that, you know, that thinking in English completely out of my head. And therefore, sometimes, on social media, when I do put in something like a painting or a moment I want to share, I find it extremely difficult. And even when I was presenting earlier, I felt like I had to use the words that are always in my head and the kind of language that we share. I try to translate things, and the kind of a lot of meaning is lost, obviously. And since this is a place where stories are told, where um, it's so heightened in emotion, and grief is discussed. Grief is often discussed in ways, especially when you sit on like in a place like a shrine. Grief is discussed in in a contrast to sort of like it's sort of like talking about grief on a horizon. So it is not just grief which is there in that moment. It's also, what do we do with this grief? What does this grief mean? What does it mean to be human? So these bigger philosophical questions are immediately tied to the everyday discussion in a shrine. So this kind of like transcendence to, everyday life trivia discussion to like immediately the questions of existence, this kind of shift requires one to be so articulate and to have your own mother tongue then help. That's where it helps you out. And when you go back to like the poets like Miranis, or you read Ghalib, that's where you understand that all of that work is here, all of those words, all those connections, that like that very minute right now moment to that really big universal cosmic moment. This is already connected for me in this poetry and the Marcia writings and the Noha writings. So I suppose, yeah, for me, it's all a process of unlearning, thinking in that way, the way I've been taught to think in university.
So yeah, you have a question, right? About the crowd of the Mazar you hosted. This is by Quasi Fahimanas, and she's just trying to understand the environment there to get a better picture of how the male-female devotee ratio might be.
You see, about a decade ago, or maybe it was 15 years ago, there were no men allowed in this shrine. This was a very small neighborhood sort of space. This is around about 900 square feet. It's not a big place as well. But so men were not allowed here. And slowly and gradually, like I mentioned, since it makes Pakistan such an exceptional state to have Bibi Ruqayya be here, the daughter of, the fourth Imam and the first Caliph to be the fourth Caliph to be here is a big deal. So it kind of brought a lot of attention. And then as I mentioned, it was, an ideal place to bring in affluent classes to create a bigger, more attractive shrine. And that's the point where a lot more men started coming in, and they were allowed to a certain till a certain point. And then slowly and gradually, the men started coming closer to the grave as well. The grave was considered to be a place where only women were allowed, but eventually, with some shifts in administration and changes, we have seen over time that it's literally split in half now, with men on one side and women on the other. Even now, the workers of the shrine are very upset about the fact that men can come and touch the grave, even though you see this entire thing is about her cloak, about her wanting to be taken away, disappeared under the ground, so that the Hindu king couldn't reach her body. And so the idea was that veiling was such a strong aspect, and remaining behind a certain kind of a parda or a veil was such an important aspect of this place, that now this is a contested situation. They are trying to keep the men out again. They're trying to push them out, and to keep them in a certain space so that they don't come and touch the grave at least. But a lot of different. I'm an architect. I see how in different ways architecture responds to these very small sentimental decisions that are made within the shrine, and then how they're translated or they're communicated to the bigger decision makers. The women have a very strong voice. I have noticed how, despite the fact that men reach and touch the grave, the women who stand there, Rihanna, for example, who is the caretaker of the graves, especially, she pushes a lot of men away from her. She has a small body, but when there are lots of men, she's pushing them away. She doesn't let them kiss the main door. And I've noticed how she does completely on her own doing this on very crowded days. And I often ask her, like, this is something you need to get authorities, you need to have a stronger policy in place, so you don't have to physically push them away. But this is how it is. A lot of women also make sure that the women who work there make sure that other women who come through are not veiled. So a lot of times a woman would be entering this space with the veil, with covering her head. But as she goes closer to Bibi Ruqayyah's grave, she takes the veil off. So this engagement of women with the saint is very intimate. It's encouraged to be intimate. They protested against the CCTV cameras to be placed closer to the graves because the women are unveiled at that point. And so these kind of little struggles are always there, and they do, in some cases, on a daily basis, things are working out for them. And the system is in place to make that place a place for the way people want it to be. But however, having said that, we still see a lot of men. Most of the decision makers are men. On the board of directors who are making aesthetic decisions, they're mostly men. The architects and the developers are all mostly men, except for one woman. So yeah, decision makers are there. Within that space, within that ambiguity, there are lots of different things are happening.
Yeah, Malvika, anything else? Any question? No, before we wind up, I will, if you have missed anything, if you want to add anything, also your observations about your experience of the exhibition, but also our attempt to forge this solidarity of the global south, of the people, the historically oppressed, uh, who are using different ways of expressing themselves. I always remember this quote by Salman Rushdie that against the great adversities, remembrance was our only weapon. And along with remembrance, I think today Malvika has added few other terms like reinterpretation, resisting, expanding. So these are also our weapons, along with reclaiming. So all these are our weapons against the adversities, the greater adversity, the historical adversities. And I'm not saying that all of us, in a way, are also operating via a combative assertion, like Alan Badiou calls as the militant philosophers or militant aestheticians. There's also humility in many of the works. There's also irony in many of the works, as much as there is irreverence. All these are languages of self-defense, and all these are the weapons of the oppressed. And maybe survive all of this together and come out healed and beautifully with more hope is what I um, think of. But if you have any afterthoughts, please, this is the time.
I just wanted to add, as part of the thank you to all of you for joining and for uh, sharing all your work and your thoughts and your inquiries, which is out there. I just wanted to say that amongst all of you, like what Bibi was talking about from the tree itself, because as part of some of our conversation, we are talking about more than a human, and that how the tree was breathing, and there was no voice from the tree, but it is there. People are feeling it, and more artists are coming out talking about the more than the human, how, and also looking at the micro stories that um, um, Wambo had shared, and Sian, your work, where, the whole thing of tilling of the land and the tillers. And because I'm part of this group, we're looking at something on soil itself. So I felt how each one of you have contributed. And like the next one is going to be in Ecuador, where main players were the women. I feel somewhere, all these voices together is adding more to what I've been thinking, what I've been working on. So thank you so much for this amazing evening and this 2 hours. Please, others, if you want to add to it, please do add. I wanted to grab the opportunity. Thank you.
Any thoughts, Kian, Lamboy, Bibi? Thank you so much. If there's anything to conclude, okay. Then I think that's it. And I
So
just want to Oh, someone said thank you. Thank you, Zara, for joining us, and thank you to everyone for joining us on this Sunday for Rai Opinions. And we hope to do many more of these sort of engagements to hold space for vital conversations. And I want to thank all of our artists for all your work and all your efforts.
Yeah,
I feel like all of
thanks
you are
from my side
actively,
too. Thanks from my side too
yeah,
to all the artists and the participants in this panel discussion. Bibi, Sian, Vanui, thanks a lot. But yeah, Malavika, please continue.
not just like I feel like everyone here is actively holding space to make visible the things that are systemically forgotten or attempted to be erased. And I think that's really powerful. And it's really inspiring that all of you are dedicating your lives and your practices towards it. And that's the three of you and Premjish, like your curation here with Imperial Silhouettes was deeply inspiring to me and to all of us on the team. Um, it takes a lot to be able to negotiate between ethics and aesthetics and the empire and to put forth a narrative that's so powerful but also sensitive and led with a lot of sensitivity. And I think that takes a lot of courage. And it's been great to have the show here and to engage with this for the last 3 months and to many, many, many more conversations to come. Yes, thank you so much to everyone for joining. And thanks to our directors, Shafina and Meena, for giving us space to have these sort of conversations. And I hope this would be the first of many, and we look forward to making more rooms and more Zoom links and bubbles
And
where we
a
can
big
explore.
thanks to you for running around, for making this happen with less sleep, early getting up, being there, doing the like opening the crates to painting the walls and doing everything, and thinking also along with me. Your presence was invaluable. Thanks to you.
Thank you, thank you. So yeah, I think there's not much to say. So much has been said, but like I hope we can continue to resist and reclaim and revive and re-own our narratives and our bodies and the world that we're kind of occupying together. Thank you so much. Hope to see you all very soon. And thank you to Cheryl, my colleague, for helping conduct this whole thing together. Shafina is here. Is Shafina here? Shafina? Is she here?
He sent a
Shafina, if
message.
you are here, would you like to say a few words or? Okay, never mind. Thank you, Shafina. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for joining. See you all very soon.